Thank you very much, Helmut, for inviting me to speak to you today on the occasion of this graduation. We were both assistant professors in central New Jersey 25 years ago, so it's a real great pleasure to reconnect with Helmut now that we're both grown up, more or less. So it's also a true pleasure to be here because the individuals being honored today are simply highly unusual people. A quick look at their bios suggests that they are a group of young international leaders with an extraordinarily diverse set of experience. And because of this richness of background, I would have loved to spend a year with you to learn from you, but I have only a few minutes, and unfortunately, I will be doing all the talking. So I want to use the time I have at my disposal to invite you to reflect with me on what may define a successful society and how you can go about contributing to fostering such a society given the unique tools that you have developed here at Hertie and in your previous lives. And I hope that this will be more than a boring scholarly exercise for you given the road ahead. So thinking about the dimensions that make a society successful should be central to your lives moving forward. And it will keep you going when you will have reached the heights of your professional career. And that is very serious, because at the end, when all is done, doing things is about much more than our narcissistic selves, because this narcissism gets old really fast. It is really about the impact that we can have on the lives of others, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So there are many ways that one can define a successful society. Of course, the usual response for economists has often been to use the traditional economic performance measures. But I believe that to avoid ethnocentrism and to do something truly meaningful, one needs to adopt a much more multidimensional understanding of successful societies that makes room for cultural dimensions and institutional dimensions. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize laureate, set the agenda by, as he is the mind behind the Human Development Index that the UN has embraced, which emphasizes capabilities and which goes beyond the usual economic measures to factor in life expectancy, literacy, education, and standard of living. But in the work that I've been doing with a dozen colleagues for the last 10 years, we propose an approach that is even broader, and we consider the beast from several angles, which corresponds to our various areas of expertise as researchers. So to try to have us think about this together, I will invite you to think about the Indian parable of the 5 blind men who together are trying to describe what an elephant might look like. So one touches a leg of the elephant and he explains to the others that the whole of the beast, the whole of the elephant is really like the trunk of a tree. Another one touches the trunk of the elephant and reaches very different conclusion. But at the end of the day, being able to touch all the parts of the elephant is what allows us to comprehend what the animal looks like. And so it goes for successful societies. And this is precisely what we've tried to do in our interdisciplinary group. So, of course, one wants to factor in these economic indicators. They are absolutely crucial, but I would argue they're not enough. One will also want to include what is valued across all civilizations. For instance, the health-related factors, which are so important. Low infant mortality, high life expectancy. Very few people on the planet will debate its importance. But again, it's not enough. Then there's also the questions that have kept so many social scientists busy over the last few decades. Questions of corruption, sustainable development, effective government. But again, thinking in terms of these dimensions, I think, is limited. I would argue that we need to also consider questions of recognition, of identity, that are very rarely put in the equation, and institutions themselves, how these institutions empower collective capabilities, which we need to to pursue important projects together. And that these two dimensions, cultural repertoire and institutions, are essential to sustain social resilience, not only individual resilience, social resilience, which will allow individuals and groups to better absorb the wear and tear of everyday life, which epidemiologists talk about when they talk about the impact of inequality on people's lives, and will empower people to lead meaningful lives despite all the challenges that they encounter. So first, the Canadian in me, of course, wants to put in the equation issues of multiculturalism, diversity, and the ability to maintain low intergroup conflict as a key dimension of successful society. There's a very important paper that was published this year in Perspective on Politics by Wright and Irene Blumrad, which shows that there's a strong correlation between the extent to which societies adopt multicultural policies, for instance, encourage schools to teach, to empower immigrants to maintain their language, and the level of emotional and cognitive investments that immigrants make in their society, which manifests itself, for instance, in their desire to participate in politics. So this has to do here with recognition. The adoption of multicultural policy carries a message about who is valued in a society and who belongs. Another excellent example is my colleague Prudence Carter, who wrote a book comparing high schools in South Africa and the US, and she showed that the schools in South Africa that succeeded the best were also the schools that engaged in policies that facilitated recognition, that, for instance, allowed black girls to wear dreadlocks as opposed to encouraging black hair to look like white hair. So this is a case where a specific policy sends implicit messages about who belongs, who is valued. It's not only about aesthetics and presentation of self, and it's about the definition of dominant norms, and it's about the definition of cultural membership and policies. The world in which you're going to enter, and in which most of you have already been active, has a lot to do with sending such implicit messages about symbolic politics, about recognition. So this, I think, is the new frontier for policymakers. And I think many people are now starting to recognize the importance of symbolic politics for the making of a healthy society. For instance, by adopting policies toward the poor that stigmatizes them less, universal policies as opposed to means-tested policies, for instance. Another crucial dimension is collective capacities, which is closely related to the ability to mobilize a population in the pursuit of collective ends. Think, for instance, of the ability of African governments to mobilize their population to fight the AIDS crisis. One of the members of our group, Anne Swidler, has studied closely how Uganda and Botswana went about meeting this crisis, and she found that while Botswana had a far better organized and far more developed state capacity, Uganda proved to be much more effective at fighting the AIDS crisis, in part because this less organized government was able to work very closely with grassroots organizations to sustain a collective identity of, yes, we can do this together. So they mobilized the local chiefs and they mobilized grassroots organizations to project messages about we are here in this together and we can transform the situation together. So in this case, too, culture proved to be a powerful motivator and a tool for policy making that could have been overlooked. So we have many other such examples. State capacity is nice, but Botswana had been far more successful than Uganda and had a more efficient bureaucracy, but it did lack the connections to civil society organizations to make the project successful. So many of the challenges that Europe encounters today are presented mostly as economic challenges. Of course, the crisis of the euro above all. And of course, institutions have much to do with this crisis, but we're also witnessing a decline in the emotional investment that people are making in European institutions. And there's, of course, the lingering crisis of Fortress Europe, the question of how the EU can deal with the many people from the global south that are clamoring at its doors, hoping to get a foot in. Like in the US, Europe's fate has been tied to this history of immigration, to its ability to absorb talents from all over the world and to turn them into little Frenchmen and Polish and English and German people, little Henri and Fritz and Bartov. We know from research that nested identities have often been the key to this success. For instance, allowing the Portuguese concierge in Paris to be French and from Lisbon at once, cumulating identities. And this is true of the US also, where freedom of religion and freedom of speech have been essential to the success of American society, and which I would dare to say has been dealing much better than many European societies with the questions of the headscarves and the challenges that are brought to us by multiculturalism. Studies of cultural taste in the US and elsewhere have all come to the similar conclusion when we're looking at the cultural habits of the middle class. We're all becoming much more omnivorous. We like opera, jazz, as well as Michael Jackson. It is not a world of cultural distinction like the one that existed in the beginning of the 20th century when it comes to the elite. We value a cultural breadth that empowers hybridity. In the United States, this hybridity also helps us understand the success of low-income African-American students. We know from research that those who succeed better are those who have both a very strong sense of their racial identity, but who are also bilingual, able to negotiate the dominant idiom of the classroom, the culture that is valued by their professors. Those who triumph are the cultural straddlers. They are the ones who are able to be both at the top of a pecking order defined by the students, where being cool and familiar with pop music is crucial, and the pecking order that is valued by the teachers, which has to do with academic performance. Those who win are those who are high on both of these hierarchies that matter enormously for academic success. Similarly, among the First Nation people of Canada, the nations where the suicide rate is the lowest are those where adults have cultivated among their youth a feeling of pride in their common culture, which empowers a collective identity, but without isolation. These tribes cultivate an empowering collective imagery which sustains possible selves, a sense of, yes, we can do this together. And I believe that identities can be sustained for the greater good through institutions and policies. I'm sure that although you're here in Berlin, you've all been keeping an eye on what's happening in the US. In the Republican and Democratic Convention, we have a wonderful occasion for reflecting on what is the United States about and how strongly divided it really is. Since I got here 24 hours ago, several people have asked me, is the country really coming apart? Contrasted worldviews have been put on the stage when, for instance, we compare the messages provided by Michelle Obama and Ann Romney about their men. So in the US, like in Europe, we seem to be at a crossroad again. Will we reinvest in education as the engine for upward mobility that feeds the American dream, or should the state stay out of the way to empower individual initiative and free enterprise? These messages are narrative, they're cultural construct about social membership and social justice. And such narratives are created by policymakers, by people like yourself, and by people like me. So I think all this matters enormously, because in the US, the two parties are in fact sustaining radically different visions of what defines a valuable contribution to society, of who is a worthy person. Research on the culture wars shows that homosexuality and abortion are really the only main dividing issues in the American population. But they contain much more in terms of taken for granted concerning the importance of self-sufficiency and morality in defining cultural citizenship in the US. Yet many Americans are still turning to Europe, and above all to Germany and the Scandinavian countries, for a model of successful society where social justice remains central and where the lives of the poor are less miserable. Whether Europe, and Germany in particular, can continue to sustain this message in the context of the present crisis remains to be seen. You will be called to make a difference somewhere as you move beyond the walls of the Hertie School. As you do so, again, I simply want to invite you to keep in mind this question of successful societies, so as not to lose focus and not to forget the question of ultimate ends, because, again, beyond our individual careers and ambition, this is what feeds individuals. As Michelle Obama stated on Tuesday, speaking about her husband, being in office can change you, but most importantly, it can also reveal who you truly are in the best sense of the term, and may the latter applies to you. So goodbye and good luck.